the city of the Anunnaki. Archaeologists recently discovered an ancient metropolis over 200,000 years old in Africa. Some people think this metropolitan area was home to the legendary Anunnaki, the great celestial gods that came down from the heavens and gave human beings life. The Mesopotamians worshipped these beings as gods, yet nobody knows where they went. They just showed up on the planet, allowed the first great civilizations to worship them, and then they disappeared. At least that's the fun story, but in reality they were most likely gods that faded over time, like the gods on Mount Olympus. Researchers discovered this bizarre city in southern Africa, in a remote region with very few humans. Locals have known about the ruins for centuries, but they never thought much about them that we know of. They thought the old broken walls were just the remnants of ancient farms. But this area was covered in gold deposits, most of which have been taken over the past 500 years. Some believe the Anunnaki settled here specifically to mine gold and created human workers using advanced genetic technology. Of course, this is all speculation. There may be some small ruins here, leftovers from an unknown ancient civilization. But they've only been seen through satellite images in the past and are heavily eroded. Mainstream scientists haven't said a word about this discovery, which, if true, would push back the date of the first great city on Earth by over 190,000 years. The Gojian Blade. About 50 years ago, archaeologists discovered an unusual sword inside a Chinese tomb. This sword was over 2,000 years old, and it shocked archaeologists because it didn't have a single trace of rust. The blade looked perfect when they excavated it, and it even drew blood when an archaeologist pressed his finger against its edge. Somehow, this sword had not been affected by 2,000 years sealed underground. The craftsmanship was remarkable. The sword was covered in detailed markings, and it seemed too perfect for something crafted so long ago. It was so impressive that the government of China declared it a state treasure. And for the Chinese, this sword is now as famous as King Arthur's Excalibur. Archaeologists originally found the sword in 1965 while they were surveying the ruins of Jinan, the old capital of the Chu state. During the excavations, they came across 50 ancient tombs. They found over 2,000 artifacts, along with what came to be known as the Gojian sword. The sword was in a wooden box that had been placed next to a skeleton, untarnished, made from solid bronze, and still sheathed in the scabbard. It's a double-edged straight sword, one of the earliest types used in China, and according to the inscription on the sword, it belonged to the King of Yu. The big mystery is that archaeologists don't know which King of Yu owned the sword, and nobody knows how the sword remained so sharp while being stuck in a box for 2,000 years. Researchers believe it has something to do with the unique properties of the sword, but all these years later, nobody has replicated the technology used to make it or identify all of its specific properties. Antigravity jars. About 300 years ago in India, antigravity jars were created. These magical jars could be filled with water, flipped upside down, and no water would come out. 3 centuries ago, seeing the magic jar in action blew people's minds. They didn't realize what they were seeing was just science, and they thought they were seeing magic. You can see one of these jars at the Museum of Kanchipuram. It was made of clay, but it has no top opening to fill it up. The only way to fill the jar with water is to flip it over and then pour water through the 5 holes at the bottom. When you flip the jar back over, not a single drop of water leaks out from any of the holes. The only way to get the water out is by pouring it through the spout at the top. There aren't any moving parts inside the jar. Instead, an unknown genius figured out how to fit twin funnels and a 90-degree bent pipe inside the jar to make it seem like magic. We don't know who invented the jar, but we know where it first appeared, in a village called Karigiri. The potters here were so creative that they built over 100 varieties of magic jars, although there are only 12 left today, and they are all in museums. The Great Mechanism. One of the most mysterious things ever pulled out of the ocean has got to be the Antikythera mechanism, dubbed the world's first computer. Sponge divers found it near the Greek island of Antikythera back in 1901. The computer is about the size of a shoebox, a bizarre contraption made of gears and dials, and it almost looks like the insides of a giant clock. You may have heard about the world's first computer before, but what I'm about to tell you is brand new. Archaeologists believe they have finally figured out the time when this mechanism first started ticking, December 22nd, 178 BC. This was not an easy conclusion to make. Scientists have been struggling for 120 years to figure out who made the device, why they made it, and what they used it for. Recently, there has been a lot of speculation about ancient aliens and the mechanism being a lost component to one of their machines. But the mechanism had probably been used as a type of calendar. The machine could predict when the next eclipse would happen, it could determine when athletic games were to take place, and other things like that. Researchers with the Functional Reconstruction of Antikythera Mechanism project got the start date by looking at the earliest day that any calculation on the machine could be made. There was a solar eclipse on December 22nd that lasted over 12 minutes, and December 23rd is the winter solstice. It makes sense that the machine that predicted eclipses was activated on the same day as one. There's still a lot of mystery here. We don't know how the mechanism was made, who figured out the complicated math, or who was going to use it. Martians in Japan. If you haven't heard the theory that a cataclysmic event happened on Mars hundreds of years ago and forced all the inhabitants to settle on Earth, now you have. It's completely outrageous. There is no evidence to support that a war on the Martian surface forced everyone to move one planet over, but some people are convinced. To help back up this bizarre theory, a connection has been made between a rock formation on the Red Planet and a historical structure in Japan. The Japanese made the Kofun tomb look like a giant keyhole. It is an immense burial mound still holding the remains of a long-dead Japanese emperor. The tomb is so big that it's still one of the largest monuments ever built, measuring over 1,500 feet long. A similar structure was found on the Martian surface using satellite images. It's dusty and red, yet it looks just like the keyhole burial mound in the Osaka prefecture of Japan. There is no denying the distinct keyhole shape is nearly the same. Conspiracy theorists argue that the one on Mars could be the remnants of an ancient burial mound, proving that humans might have lived on Mars. Or it could just be a coincidence, and the keyhole-shaped structure on Mars could just be a normal rock formation. Crusader hand grenades. Archaeologists have discovered ancient ceramic pots in Jerusalem. Scientists say the Crusaders used these strange pots, which were made in the 11th and 12th centuries, as hand grenades. This would make them some of the first hand-thrown explosives in the world. But scientists aren't 100% sure yet. They know these ceramic pots were used for all kinds of different things. Ancient people used them to hold mercury, as containers for oil, and just to drink out of. But new research by the Griffith University in Queensland has shown that at least one vessel contained potentially explosive material. The other 3 shards they looked at contained traces of oils and medicines. The 4th one had traces of sulfur, magnesium, and mercury. It could very well be that the Crusaders had figured out how to turn black powder into a devastating aerial bomb. Black powder was invented in ancient China and brought to the Middle East and Europe in the 13th century, right around the time Europeans made these pots. Mysterious stone discs. A team of researchers found over a dozen mysterious carved discs in Russia near Volgograd. This happened back in 2015 and was immediately controversial. The research team claimed that the strange discs they found contained a high-density metal called tungsten, something found mostly in military technology. And while the origin and nature of these strange stone discs remain a mystery, many believe they could be chunks of debris from an ancient spaceship. Though the team had discovered over 12 disc-shaped rocks earlier, they recently found a much larger one. One researcher, Vadim Chernobrov, told a Russian news agency, "We already found a dozen of these discs of not more than 3 feet in diameter, and in Kuzbas a disc of about 6.5 feet in diameter." The issue is the tungsten. It shouldn't be in an ordinary rock, never mind in 12 random discs of stone buried in the Russian wilderness. UFO junkies were quick to connect the stones to extraterrestrial technology. but the stones are probably just the result of erosion. This kind of thing can happen over millions of years, which is why you can find perfectly circular rocks on just about every beach in the world. These stone discs are strange, and their chemical composition is questionable. But for now, there is no more information to go on. Skinwalker Ranch. If there's one strange place in the US where scientists are stumped, it's Skinwalker Ranch. The property, which is 512 acres in northeast Utah, was home to an explosion of UFO sightings in the 1960s and 70s. Then, going on into the 1990s, stories came out about cattle mutilations and more alien sightings. It's also a paranormal hotspot, with a high concentration of both UFO sightings, electromagnetic anomalies, and unexplained happenings. Brandon Fugal, a real estate mogul, purchased the property in 2016 to conduct scientific research. He wanted to see if the ranch was as spooky as everyone said. He was hoping to look at things from a more scientific perspective, seeing if he could pinpoint the source of all the strangeness, whether it be a thin wall between planes of existence or just something in the soil. Fugal said that he acquired the property from billionaire Robert Bigelow for the purpose of conducting scientific research to determine if there was any validity to the extraordinary claims of paranormal activity. He said, although I acquired the ranch as a skeptic, I eventually had my own undeniable close encounter, a UFO sighting in broad daylight with multiple witnesses. But so far, nobody has come up with anything. Skinwalker Ranch is an anomaly, where people see spirits and aliens, but nobody knows why. The Hanging Pillar. At the 16th century Lepashki temple in India, there is something rather unusual. The Indian temple features stunning sculptures of gods and goddesses, beautiful reliefs of dancers and musicians, and countless paintings plastered over the walls. Its columns are huge, showcasing some of the most impressive architecture in the country. There is a large fresco of Virabhadra, which is the biggest fresco of an ancient god in the country. There is even a giant bull at the front of the temple carved from a single block of stone, supposedly the biggest in the world. But the incredible engineering goes one step further with a wonder that nobody can quite figure out. 70 stone pillars are supporting the ceiling, but one of them isn't touching the ground. It's floating above the surface, only about half an inch. But it's enough to pass pieces of paper, scraps of cloth, and other things directly underneath it. The pillar is simply floating, attached to the ceiling and not even touching the ground. We don't know how this is happening or exactly why the column ended up like that. Locals say it happened when a British engineer tried to remove the pillar as part of an attempt to uncover the secret of how the temple was built. But he failed, the column was dislodged, and now it floats. What's your theory? Let me know in the comments below. The ICA Stones. The ICA Stones may or may not be real. They can be traced back to Dr. Javier Cabrera d'Arquea, who was given a mysterious stone tablet by a Peruvian farmer. The stone showed a strange fish, one that appeared to exist long before humans ever roamed the earth. It was the doctor's impression that either aliens had given humans the insider info about the extinct fish, or the timeline of human evolution and mass extinctions were wrong. This was an intriguing idea, and so Cabrera went searching for more of these mysterious stones. He found a cave loaded with them, over 100,000 stones with unbelievable engravings, yet he told no one where this cave was, preventing thieves from taking the stones for themselves. As he found more and more of these stones, the pictures on them got even crazier. Some stones were carved with modern surgeries, flying machines, humans riding dinosaurs, and astronomical knowledge that only 20th century humans have. It was at this point that people realized Cabrera was nuts. The original farmer who gave the first stone to Cabrera admitted he had carved it himself. No scientific studies have ever been done to prove the ICA stones are genuine, and after Cabrera died in 2001, there was nobody left to say the stones were authentic. Most scientists agree they were part of an elaborate hoax to get more tourists into the region. Did it work? Medieval Cambodia. A lost medieval city was discovered hiding underneath the Cambodian jungle. Even though the city was lost, archaeologists had already known about it thanks to inscriptions discovered near Angkor Wat. These inscriptions are over 1,200 years old. describing a mysterious place hidden beneath the dense forest on the holy mountain called Phnom Kulen. Yet even with the inscriptions, nobody knew its exact location. At least, not until a team of researchers in 2012, led by Cambodia's Archaeology and Development Foundation, used airborne laser scanning to look for it. They scanned an area of about 140 square miles of unexplored, dense jungle. And sure enough, an entire cityscape came into view. I'm talking about roadways, temples, urban infrastructure, and hundreds of other ruins. It existed between the 8th and 9th century and may have been one of the very first capitals of the great Khmer Empire, called Mahendra Parvata. It was probably abandoned just before the capital was moved to Angkor. But even though researchers have identified the city, they still haven't uncovered it. Unfortunately, it's so deep in the jungle, and resources are so scarce for archaeological projects in Cambodia, that archaeologists haven't descended on the site. It's still there, hiding in the jungle, waiting for enough funding and interest to be excavated. Secret Inca City. In the South American jungle, archaeologists came across a secret city built by the great Inca Empire that had been forgotten for over 500 years. As you may already know, the Inca dominated the Peruvian highlands up until the very last stronghold was conquered by the Spanish in the year 1572. Machu Picchu may be the most famous Inca city, but there are hundreds more of them spread across the country. Espiritu Pampa is one of those cities, forgotten at the end of an old Inca road on an eastern slope in the Peruvian Andes. It's surrounded on all sides by cloud forest, so deep in the middle of nowhere that it takes at least 4 days walking just to reach the border. The only way there is by hacking through the forest with a machete. The ruins of the city sprawl in all directions, each piece of stone covered in moss, and most of the structures broken beyond repair. Thick roots have taken over the buildings, stonework has all but crumbled, and little vestiges of the city's once former glory remain. The city was first discovered by the explorer Vincent Lee in the 1980s. At the time, it was very difficult for archaeologists to reach this part of Peru because it was controlled by guerrilla soldiers. Historians believe this was the last stage of Inca resistance. When all their other cities had fallen, the remaining Inca retreated here to their most isolated fortress at Espiritu Pampa. Then, as far as the legend goes, a betrayer gave away the city's location to the Spanish. They then marched upon it with every intention of burning it to the ground. Instead, it was the Inca who burned their own city and fled into the forest. City of the Caesars. The City of the Caesars, also known as the City of Patagonia, is a lost city that may or may not have ever existed. It's a major mystery because even though no one has ever technically found the city, there are plenty of historical accounts that talk about it. The accounts all say the city was located somewhere in Patagonia, in a deep valley between Chile and Argentina. It was prosperous, rich in both gold and diamonds, and almost impossible to find. One of the legends is that the city is surrounded by an impenetrable fog that keeps it hidden from weary explorers. There's also a legend that says the city will remain hidden until the end of time as a safe haven for the native people of South America, who were so terribly wronged at the hands of the Spanish conquistadors. Now you're probably getting Atlantis or Shangri-La vibes here. And while it's true there are no records of people seeing the city with their own eyes, there are dozens of accounts of Spanish conquistadors and explorers hearing rumors of the city. It is now known as the Invisible City of South America. It's apparently accessible through a small pathway between two enormous mountains. But despite how hard people have searched for the past 500 years, the city itself, or confirmation of its previous existence, has still never been found. Do you think the City of the Caesars will ever be discovered? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Palenque. Palenque can be found in the foothills of the Chiapas state in Mexico. Over 1,400 years ago, it was an important Maya city and a fortified stronghold deep in the untamable jungles. It was the capital and the southernmost region of what is now Mexico, a much denser and more wild area than other parts of the Maya kingdom. And even though the rulers of Palenque controlled a massive territory and had alliances with other cities like Tikal, life here was very different. When we think of the Maya civilization, we tend to think of one group of people. But the truth is that each city and each territory was unique, with its own king and its own social structure. The first king of Palenque was Kuuk Balam I in 431. The most famous, perhaps, was Kiinich Janab Pakal I, aka Pakal the Great. It was Pakal the Great who created a dynasty which would last for 4 generations and see the city reach its highest point of prosperity before suddenly collapsing and being abandoned around the year 800. After the fall of the Maya Empire, Palenque was lost in the deserted jungle for over 1,000 years. Polona Rua. Polona Rua was built as the second capital of a great empire in Sri Lanka after the destruction of the city of Anuradhapura in the year 993. It was initially built as a temporary royal residence, but grew in the 10th century and became the capital of the Chola dynasty. Not those cholas, different cholas. This was short-lived. In the year 1070, the king of the Sinhalese kingdom conquered the city and exiled the Cholas. They then used it as their own capital for the next 300 years. In the 12th century, mass building projects were undertaken and the city grew even larger. Palaces, monuments, beautiful parks and gardens. Even today, the preserved ruins of many of these places still stand, as well as enormous Buddhist sculptures that once decorated the city. One of the greatest monuments in Polona Rua is a sacred structure called Jadije, which still houses a massive headless Buddha statue. In the year 1214, the jungle city was destroyed. An invasion by the South Indian Arya Chakravarti dynasty and its warlord, King Kalinga Maga, saw the city burn to the ground. This resulted in the Buddhist civilization of North Sri Lanka being utterly destroyed. Guayabo de Turielba. One of the most significant ancient places in Costa Rica is Guayabo de Turielba. It's a mysterious city in the jungle that was declared a national monument by the government in 1973. What makes this unique and historically significant place so mysterious? The people who built this lost city left no evidence of who they were or what they were called, and so archaeologists don't even have a name for them. All we have is archaeological evidence from the site revealing it was inhabited around the year 1000 BC, or at the same time the city of Jerusalem was founded. It peaked about 2,000 years later in the 9th century AD, with a population of around 10,000. That would have made it the biggest and most important regional center of politics, culture, and religion in all of Costa Rica. Based on other archaeological evidence, there is nothing to suggest that people who lived here were a warring society like the Maya or the Aztec, or that they practiced human sacrifice. Great monuments reveal that they were likely ruled by chieftains, a primary authority figure important enough to demand that people build great works of stone in commemoration of their rule. But the story of Guayabo de Turielba ends around 1400 AD, before the Spanish conquistadors ever arrived. For an unknown reason, these mysterious people vanished into the jungle and abandoned their city. It was only rediscovered hundreds of years later in the 19th century, and since then, only a small portion of it has been excavated because it is so remote. Wienkum. In the year 1288, the great King Mangrai of what is today Thailand relocated the capital of the ancient Lana kingdom from where it had been in Chiang Rai to Wienkum, located on the banks of the Ping River. This was before the current Thai kingdom, and even before the kingdom of Siam. But by the year 1296, the king realized he had made a huge mistake in choosing the location of his new city. Being on the riverside did have some advantages, but the area was prone to seasonal flooding. He had no choice but to create a new city, which would become the modern tourist capital of Chiang Mai. Perhaps you've heard of it, or maybe you've even been there. Let me know in the comments. With Wienkum abandoned, it became the victim of annual flooding for 700 years. This buried the lost city in the jungle several feet underground. It wasn't rediscovered until 1984, when a collection of ancient tablets were uncovered about 2 miles from the metropolitan area of Chiang Mai. Archaeologists moved in and started excavating and were shocked to find the ancient lost city. Since its initial discovery, over 30 archaeological sites have been found in Wienkum. Even though it had only been a major capital for a decade, the Lana still managed to build temples, enormous wats, which are monasteries or temples, and suburban neighborhoods. It was spread out across a massive patch of jungle alongside the river, so big that you can't even cover the whole place on foot. The only way to see all of Wienkum today is by bicycle or tuk-tuk. El Pilar. El Pilar is an ancient Maya city on the border of Belize and Guatemala, an amazing place filled with houses, temples, and monumental pieces of ancient architecture. It was first documented by archaeologist Annabelle Ford in 1983. She worked closely with local Maya descendants to map the area and perform the first excavations. It was the very first time people had taken an interest in the jungle ruins since they were abandoned around 1,000 years ago. Before this great city was abandoned, it was a major gathering place for 1,300 years. Nestled in the forest, surrounded by a natural environment, El Pilar's golden years were between 500 and 1000 AD. But much like other places in the Maya kingdom, the rulers practiced extensive agriculture and slash-and-burn methods, ultimately tearing the land apart. Even though their agriculture was nothing compared to our modern agriculture, 500 years of abuse really did a number on the jungle. When the empire started collapsing in the year 900, El Pilar lasted quite a bit longer than many other cities because of its remote location. But it did eventually fall. The people left, and it was abandoned to be consumed by the surrounding jungle. Kota Gelanji. Kota Gelanji is a lost Malaysian city discovered less than 2 decades ago in 2005. Archaeologists believe it was established around the year 650 by one of the oldest kingdoms to ever live on the Malay Peninsula. The site is in the sweltering jungles of southern Malaysia, inside a forest reserve. The earliest modern mention of the city goes back to the 17th century, when local historians described it as a fortress rendered of black stone. But we don't actually know who built the city or what happened to them. Some historians say it was part of the Ayutthaya Kingdom of Thailand, since it's mentioned so much in Siamese folklore. Inscriptions have been found detailing a raid on the city in 1025 by the Chola dynasty of Sri Lanka I told you about. But in the end, it's all quite vague and mysterious. Fast forward to the year 1881, and colonial visitors spoke of a mysterious city hiding somewhere in the jungle. Although there were some vague reports of explorers coming across it, nothing was ever confirmed. In the 1920s, Sir Richard Olaf Winstedt wrote that the local Orang Asli indigenous group was prepared to take him to the ancient city, but it never happened. The topic was forgotten, the dense forest became a preserve, and it wasn't officially found until 2005. But even now, the discovery has been controversial. It was only technically discovered using aerial inspections, topographical surveys, and from assessing local folklore. Nobody has seen the stone blocks of the city with their own eyes, but assume it's there based on satellite evidence. Cities of the Amazon. Anthropologist Michael Heckenberger with the University of Florida recently teamed up with the local Guaycurú people of Brazil's Mato Grosso state to look for lost cities in the Amazon jungle. To everyone's surprise, Michael found over 28 towns and villages that could have together supported about 50,000 people. He and his team searched over 7,700 square miles of dense forest, an area about the size of New Jersey. They uncovered the remains of houses, giant plazas, wooden palisades, defensive ditches, old ceramic cooking utensils, and even roads carved through the jungle. This was one of the biggest studies involving lost Amazonian cities that has ever been done. Many of the cities were abandoned as recently as 400 years ago. The research was a mixture of boots on the ground and satellite images, which when put together reveal a complex society of humans living inside the jungle. The oldest remains appear to be about 1,500 years old, meaning the Amazon was far more advanced than anyone had ever imagined. For about 1,000 years, various villages were connected by major roads, with smaller settlements dotting the spaces between. There were bridges, harbors built on great rivers, and fields used for growing local Amazonian foods. Archaeologists have dubbed these lost settlements garden cities. But there's still a lot of mystery. For example, we don't know why people began moving away from these urban jungle metropolises. It seems that about 400 years ago, they simply stopped being used. The people migrated to the more modern cities nearer to the coast, and life in the jungle was essentially given up by the majority of society. Ancient whale skeleton. Archaeologists discovered a gigantic skeleton in Thailand, almost perfectly preserved. It's believed to be about 5,000 years old and was discovered west of Bangkok in Samut Sakhon. Its skull alone is over 9 feet. Scientists believe the skeleton belongs to a brides's whale, which can still be found in the waters of Thailand, but is now considered a protected species. So they're around, but there aren't nearly as many as there were 5,000 years ago. They discovered the skeleton 7.5 miles inland. That's a pretty shocking distance from the water. That means that the water was so much higher thousands of years ago, stretching way farther up the shore. And on the grand scale of things, 5,000 years isn't even that long. According to researchers from the National University of Singapore, discovering this ancient whale skeleton adds to the mounting evidence that something massive happened 6,000 to 3,000 years ago in the Gulf of Thailand. The shoreline was, in some places, 10 or 20 miles higher than it is today. Mysterious insect organ. Scientists have just discovered a new organ. The only catch is that this organ isn't in the body of humans, but insects. Scientists found this new organ in 3 different groups of insects. It's a sensory organ designed to pick up vibrational signals, and it exists in plant hoppers, spittlebugs, and leafhoppers. Even more impressive is that scientists believe the bugs could use these vibrational signals to communicate with each other, turning plants into telephone lines. This organ works as a kind of receiver, but the message is sent using what researchers call timbal buckling. This communication happens when an organ inside the insect creates sound, combining with oscillatory motions to send very subtle vibrations along the surface of a plant. It's the same way that sound travels along a telephone line. One insect creates the signal, and another insect on the same surface then picks it up with the help of this organ. It may seem like a tedious discovery, but it has fascinating implications. For example, humans potentially now have a way to communicate with these specific bugs. Researchers can send signals to them received by their particular sensory organs to make the bugs react. For example, they could send a signal to keep the bugs away from specific plants, protecting crops. Plus, this discovery has flipped every idea we had about how insects communicate on its head. Scientists thought these insects picked up signals with hairs on their legs before this discovery, but as it turns out, they have an entire sensory organ inside their abdomen dedicated to communication. It's the same way we have a voice box. Marble bathtub. In the ancient Greek city of Aphrodisias, located in Turkey, someone dropped off a unique marble bathtub from 1,800 years ago at the local museum. If you've ever wondered what it was like to take a bath as a wealthy Greek citizen, now you'll have a better idea. First of all, the bathtub is amazing. It's solid marble and decorated with intense lion head reliefs. It's a unique specimen, unlike anything previously found in Turkey before. It's actually the only marble bathtub ever discovered in all of Turkey, which is saying a lot. As the borderland between Asia and Europe, Turkey has housed countless empires throughout history, yet none of them left behind a fully intact bathtub. This tub is the only example in the whole country. Of course, archaeologists have found plenty of ordinary ancient bathtubs. It's just that someone made them using layers of mud. In other words, ordinary citizens had to have mud baths or just stand in the rain to get clean. But this tub belonged to one of the wealthiest citizens in the city, probably a wealthy business person or a state administrator. It could even have been in the home of the region's ruler. Life on Europa. 390 million miles away from us is Europa, one of Jupiter's many moons. In a recent new study, scientists believe they have identified the proper ingredients on Europa for the sustainment of life. In other words, scientists recently announced that this moon far away in the solar system could be hosting, if not intelligent life, then some basic life forms. Part of this hypothesis comes from a connection scientists made between Greenland and Europa. Stanford University geophysicists compared Europa to the surface of Greenland, and they found similar features, particularly the ridges in Greenland, which formed when pockets of water froze. Oddly enough, the same formations, these frozen ridges, can be seen all over Europa. If these are the same things, the shelves on Jupiter's moon also are formed from water, and that means that water is much more abundant on Europa than anyone ever thought. Scientists are now saying there's a global ocean under those ridges, probably with more water than Earth. The issue here is that the hidden ocean is separated from the surface by an immensely thick ice sheet. And since we're so far away, there isn't a lot scientists can do to see what's underneath that layer of ice. For all we know, there could be a whole civilization of underwater creatures living on Jupiter's moon. An underground city. In 2022, researchers in Turkey announced the discovery of yet another massive underground city. This one could very well be the biggest in the entire world. If you're familiar with Turkey's mysterious subterranean villages, you'll know there are quite a few of them. There are so many underground villages in Turkey, it's a wonder anyone still lives above ground. But according to the director of the Mardin Museum, this newest city is very different from other subterranean lairs discovered in the Anatolia region. Archaeologists found it during excavations in the Midyat district in the city of Mardin. First, archaeologists discovered a cave, then a system of passageways and corridors leading down into an underground settlement with silos, water wells, ancient altars, and all the necessities of life 2,000 years ago. People built it as a hiding place, probably used by the Christians in the 2nd century when they were being persecuted. Christian families would have taken shelter deep underground to escape the Romans. Then, after so many years, the underground city was carved out to house larger numbers of people. Eventually, it became an ordinary place to live. Archaeologists believe the city was used uninterruptedly for about 1,900 years, before being abandoned roughly a century ago. At its peak, about 70,000 people lived in the nameless underground town. How would you feel about living underground? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already for more amazing discoveries. The most distant galaxy. Astronomers have just spotted what they say is the most distant galaxy ever. I mean that astronomers have identified the galaxy located farthest from our own. It's called HD1, and scientists say it contains some of the first stars that ever existed, along with a deadly supermassive black hole. They estimate the galaxy to be about 13.5 billion light-years away. That's roughly 100 million light-years further than the second most distant galaxy from us, a place called GNZ11. You might not think scientists could work out many details about a galaxy so far away, but they have. The main thing they noticed is that the universe is extraordinarily bright, radiating ultraviolet light. They believe this is because the galaxy produces over 100 stars annually, emitting incredible energy. They also say the supermassive black hole in HD1 could be about 100 million times bigger than the Sun at its center. Let that sink in for a second. Not just a bit more massive than the Sun, but 100 million times more massive. It's the oldest black hole ever observed, crowded by the earliest stars ever. According to Fabio Pacucci from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, these stars are interesting because the first stars in the universe were hotter, more luminous, and way more significant than the ones that came after, like our own Sun. Roman bust at Goodwill. In San Antonio, a trip to Goodwill turned out extremely profitable for one unsuspecting woman. In 2018, art collector Laura Young walked into her local Goodwill store and saw a sculpture that she liked the look of. She thought it was a marble bust that looked oddly ancient for being in a Goodwill. She paid $35 for it, and now, 4 years later, it's on display at the San Antonio Museum because it turns out it's hundreds of years old. It went missing in Germany during World War II. This statue was once in the collection of King Ludwig I, ruler of Bavaria. It turns out the statue is a Roman bust, made in either the 1st century BC or the 1st century AD. It depicts the son of Pompey the Great, the man who Julius Caesar defeated. Thousands of years later, King Ludwig I bought it, stashed it away in his collection, and then an American soldier looted it during the war. This soldier must have brought it back to the United States, and it probably stayed in someone's house, was passed down through generations, and then wound up in a dusty old box and donated with other attic junk. It made one heck of a journey from ancient Rome to modern America. And as much as Laura wanted to keep the precious piece of history for herself, she did the right thing by handing it over to the professionals at the museum. What would you do if you found a precious historical artifact? Let me know in the comments below. Cephalopod genomes. The genes of a cephalopod are arguably the best genes of any animal ever. These creatures are clever, sophisticated, and the closest things we have on the planet to actual aliens. They can change their color to camouflage themselves, solve puzzles, and are still surprising us. A recent new analysis of cephalopod genes has shown something extraordinary in their genome. Developmental biologist Caroline Albertin called their genome churned up. Caroline and her colleagues sequenced the genomes of 3 soft-bodied cephalopods: the California two-spot octopus, the Atlantic longfin inshore squid, and the Hawaiian bobtail squid. What the researchers discovered is quite complex. First of all, they found that the evolution of cephalopods through time was just as intense as the evolution of human beings. We both evolved similarly, especially in our brains becoming hugely cognizant. The difference is that cephalopods, rather than duplicating genomes to get different results, completely rearrange their genomes as if they threw them in a blender. In other words, they did a kind of genetic shuffle that gifted them with all of these bizarre attributes and impressive cognitive abilities. In addition, the rearranging of the genomes granted them the most powerful nervous system of any invertebrate, over 500 million neurons. Scientists confirmed that cephalopods could edit their brain genes. They can do their own RNA editing, allowing them to adapt to any new environment very quickly. Whereas most animals are at the mercy of evolution, squids and octopuses seem to have evolved beyond that, to a point where they can now adapt to rapidly shifting catastrophes by editing their genetic makeup, almost on the spot. The Merlin manuscript. Archaeologists have discovered an ancient medieval manuscript buried in a Bristol archive in England. The manuscript tells the story of Merlin, the great wizard from the legends of King Arthur. Academics at the library came across 7 parchment fragments hidden inside random volumes written between 1494 and 1502. However, the fragments are much older, written around 1250 or 1275. After doing multispectral imaging, assessing the ink, and looking at the writing style, the experts believe the story was handwritten in the northeast of France. Here's where things get a little strange. Experts were able to read this particular variant of the story of Merlin. They found that it's basically the same as all the other legends of Merlin, except really toned down, like the writer omitted certain things because they were too adult. Specifically, an intimate encounter between Merlin and the enchantress Vivian, also called the Lady of the Lake. There is a long back and forth between Merlin and Vivian in most manuscripts, and it gets pretty erotic. But in this version, all that stuff has been taken out. Of course, they still have a meeting, but it's all very innocent. Somebody took the already established story of Merlin, then transcribed it themselves, but left out all the steamy details they didn't like. Red trails. In North Carolina's Outer Banks, there's been a lot of UFO activity, and very recently there's been an explosion of it. It all began when a man took time-lapse images of the Milky Way galaxy, which was amazing. But when Wes Snyder looked at his final shots, he couldn't help but notice some weird red swirling trails in the sky. These red trails weren't part of space, nothing in the galaxy. Instead, they seemed to be moving intelligently. Snyder was a bit baffled by what he saw in the photos. He took each picture with an exposure of 10 seconds, and only 1 second passed between each image. Plus, Snyder is no stranger to the trails of jets and airplanes. Anyone who takes these photographs is used to getting planes and other things caught traveling through their pictures. You can even see the regular trails of aircraft in his pictures, but he's never caught anything before with these kinds of capabilities. Whatever was moving through the sky had incredible maneuverability and seemed to be circling something on purpose. We still don't know what left behind these bizarre red trails circling through the sky with incredible speed, but for sure there is something weird going on at the Outer Banks. Do you think a UFO was seen at an English beach? Let me know your theories in the comments, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!